The first thing I noticed wasn't the smell of wood smoke or the distant crack of a dry branch, but the absolute, suffocating silence that seemed to have swallowed the entire valley whole. I had been hiking the northern ridge of the Bitterroot Wilderness for 3 days, and yet, as I stood there in that small, unnatural clearing, the birds had stopped singing and even the wind seemed to have died in the pines. My eyes were fixed on the ground, specifically on a thin, rusted wire that was stretched barely 3 inches off the forest floor, hidden perfectly beneath a layer of deceptive pine needles. I hadn't tripped it yet, but my boot was hovering just centimeters away from a trigger that looked far too professional for a simple hunter's snare. My heart began to hammer against my ribs like a trapped bird, and as I slowly looked up, the true horror of my situation began to reveal itself in the fading gray light of the afternoon. Scattered across the clearing were dozens of life-sized mannequins, all of them dressed in weathered hiking gear that looked disturbingly familiar, their plastic faces weathered and cracked by the elements. But it wasn't their presence that made the hair on my neck stand up. It was the fact that every single one of them was positioned to face the exact spot where I was standing. Their sightless eyes converged on me as if I were the guest of honor at a funeral. I whispered a curse to myself, my voice sounding thin and fragile in the vast emptiness of the woods, and I wondered how long I had been watched before I finally noticed the trap. Who would spend years hauling plastic figures into the deepest reaches of a national forest just to orchestrate a scene of psychological warfare? Was this a joke? Or was it a warning meant for someone who had already crossed a line they couldn't see? I stepped back slowly, my breath coming in shallow hitches as I tried to mentally map the path I had taken to get here. The sun was dipping below the jagged peaks of the mountains, casting long, skeletal shadows that seemed to reach out for my ankles with every passing second. I knew that in the deep woods, darkness doesn't just fall. It rises from the ground like a black tide, and I was miles away from any established trail or ranger station. As I turned to retreat, I heard it, a sharp, metallic clack, followed by the unmistakable sound of a heavy bolt being thrown into place somewhere in the trees above me. I didn't wait to see who was pulling the lever. I turned and bolted into the thicket, my heavy pack swaying violently as I crashed through the underbrush, desperate to put distance between myself and that silent, plastic audience. The terrain changed rapidly as the light failed, the soft forest floor giving way to jagged limestone outcrops and dense clusters of mountain laurel that tore at my clothes like tiny, desperate hands. Every time I stopped to catch my breath, I heard the faint, rhythmic thud of footsteps behind me, never gaining, but never falling behind either. It was a steady, predatory pace that told me whoever was following me wasn't in a hurry because they already knew exactly where I was going. I began to ask myself questions that I didn't want to answer, like how they could move so silently through the dead leaves, or why they hadn't just confronted me when I was standing still in the clearing. Did they want me to run? Was I being herded towards something even worse than the clearing of mirrors and mannequins? By midnight, the forest had become a labyrinth of charcoal and silver, the moonlight barely penetrating the dense canopy of ancient hemlocks. My flashlight was dying, the beam flickering with a sickly yellow hue that only served to make the shadows dance and jump in the periphery of my vision. I came to a halt at the edge of a steep ravine, the sound of rushing water echoing from the darkness below like a low, growling beast. I realized then that I had been pushed into a corner of the geography I didn't recognize, a natural box, where the cliffs were too steep to climb and the river was too fast to cross safely in the dark. I turned around, my back to the drop-off, and clicked off my light to save the last of the battery, letting my eyes adjust to the gloom. That was when I saw the first flare. It wasn't a bright, rescue signal, but a dull, chemical green glow that ignited about 50 yards away, illuminating a figure standing perfectly still between two massive pines. They weren't wearing a mask or a ghillie suit. They were dressed in rugged, everyday work clothes, holding a long wooden pole with a hooked end, looking more like a farmer than a killer. But the way they stood, utterly motionless, watching me with a terrifyingly calm intensity, was more frightening than any monster I could have imagined. Another green flare ignited to my left, and then another to my right, revealing a small group of people who had effectively surrounded my position on the cliff edge. "You're on the wrong side of the creek, traveler," a voice called out, the tone shockingly polite and conversational, which only made the situation feel more surreal. It was an older man's voice, gravelly and tired, echoing off the stone walls of the ravine behind me. I shouted back that I was just a hiker, that I didn't want any trouble, and that I would leave immediately if they would just point me toward the trailhead. The silence that followed was long and heavy, punctuated only by the distant scream of a great horned owl. "The trailhead is gone," the voice replied, closer now, the green light casting a sickly, demonic hue over the trees. "We spent 10 years erasing the paths that lead here, and we can't have you going back to tell the others where the gap in the fence is." My mind raced, searching for any leverage or any way out of the invisible cage they had built around me. I realized they weren't after my money or my gear. They were protecting a secret, a private world they had carved out of the wilderness, and I was a witness they couldn't afford to let go. I looked down at the ravine again, the white foam of the rapids visible through the dark, and I knew that my only chance of survival was the one thing they didn't expect me to do. I started to talk, rambling about my family and my job, trying to sound as pathetic and non-threatening as possible while I slowly unbuckled the chest strap of my heavy backpack. I noticed the figure in the center move forward, the long pole reaching out toward me as if to hook my clothing and pull me away from the edge. "Just come with us," the man said, his voice dropping to a low, soothing hum that felt like a spider spinning a web. "We have a place for people who get lost. You'll see the mannequins were just a test of your character." As the pole swung toward me, I didn't shrink back. Instead, I lunged forward, grabbing the end of the wooden shaft with both hands and using all of my weight to yank the man toward the cliff. He stumbled, his boots sliding on the slick pine needles, and in that moment of chaos, I heaved my heavy backpack directly at the legs of the person to my right. While they scrambled to regain their balance, I didn't hesitate. I turned and leaped into the black void of the ravine. The fall felt like it lasted a lifetime, the air rushing past my ears until the freezing, mid-spring water slammed into my body like a concrete wall. The current was a violent, chaotic force that dragged me under, spinning me against smooth river rocks and filling my lungs with the taste of ancient minerals. I fought to keep my head above water, my limbs numbing instantly in the glacial temperatures. But I must have floated for miles, caught in a trance of survival and hypothermic shock, until the river finally slowed and deposited me onto a muddy bank near a low-lying bridge. I crawled out of the water, my skin blue and my clothes shredded, but as I looked back toward the dark silhouette of the mountains, I saw no lights and heard no voices. I had escaped their boundary, but as I walked toward the distant glow of a highway, I couldn't stop thinking about the mannequins. I wondered if they were still standing there in the dark, waiting for the next hiker to step over the rusted wire, and if the man with the gravelly voice was already resetting the trap for someone who wouldn't be brave enough to jump. I reached the pavement and didn't look back, knowing that some parts of the woods aren't just deep. They are owned by people who have forgotten what it means to be human. The most terrifying thing about the human voice isn't the sound itself, but the realization that it is being used as a weapon to lure you into the mouth of a trap you didn't even know was set. I was 6 days into a solo trek through the dense, rain-soaked timber of the Olympic Peninsula, a place where the moss grows so thick it swallows the sound of your own footsteps before they even hit the earth. The air was heavy with the scent of damp cedar and ancient decay, and for 3 days, I hadn't seen another living soul or even a fresh boot print on the muddy trail. I had reached a high plateau where the trees were twisted into grotesque shapes by the coastal winds, and as the sun began to slip behind the jagged horizon, I decided to pitch my tent near a natural rock outcropping for protection. I was boiling a small pot of water over my spirit stove, the quiet hiss of the flame the only company I had, when the first sound broke through the silence of the woods. "Is someone there? Please? I've twisted my ankle and I can't get down to the creek." The voice was muffled, coming from a thick stand of hemlocks about 50 yards to my west, and it sounded desperate, high-pitched, and undeniably feminine. I stood up instantly, my headlamp cutting a weak, jittery path through the gathering mist, my instincts telling me to run toward the cry for help. But as I took my first step, a cold, prickling sensation washed over my skin, and I froze in place because something about the cadence of the words felt entirely wrong. The voice didn't have the natural rasp of someone who had been yelling for hours, and the way the sentence ended was perfectly identical to a video I had recorded on my phone earlier that afternoon while documenting a beautiful waterfall. I reached into my pocket, my fingers trembling as I pulled out my device and scrolled back to the clip of the falls, playing it at the lowest possible volume. In the background of my video, a woman from another hiking group I had passed briefly at the trailhead had asked that exact same question to her companion, with the exact same inflection and the exact same pause between the words. My heart skipped a beat as I realized that someone had been close enough to me to record that specific audio. Or perhaps they had intercepted my digital signal while I was uploading it to my cloud storage earlier in the day. I stood in total darkness now, having clicked off my headlamp, listening to the forest breathe around me, while I tried to understand how a recording of a stranger's voice was playing out of the pitch-black woods. "Is someone there? Please? I've twisted my ankle and I can't get down to the creek." The voice played again, but this time it was closer, and the mechanical, tinny quality of a high-end speaker was just barely audible beneath the rustle of the leaves. I didn't call out and I didn't move toward the sound. Instead, I began to slowly pack my gear by feel, my movements deliberate and silent as I realized I was being hunted by someone who used technology to mimic the very thing we are programmed to trust. Why would someone go through the effort of setting up a remote speaker system in the middle of a wilderness area unless they wanted to lead a target into a specific pre-arranged kill zone? I looked toward the direction of the sound and saw a faint, rhythmic pulsing of a blue LED light tucked deep inside a hollow log, a digital predator waiting for me to walk into its reach. I knew that if I stayed, they would eventually realize the recording wasn't working, and they would come to investigate why their prey hadn't fallen for the bait. I abandoned my heavy tent and most of my food, keeping only my knife, my phone, and a small emergency kit, and I began to crawl backward away from the rock outcropping. The night was a wall of ink, and every time a branch snapped under the weight of the wind, I felt a jolt of pure electricity shoot through my spine. After about 20 minutes of agonizingly slow movement, I heard a different sound, a heavy, crunching footstep that wasn't trying to be quiet anymore. It was coming from the opposite direction of the speaker, suggesting that the person had been circling around to get behind me while I was distracted by the voice. I realized then that the recording wasn't just a lure. It was a distraction meant to keep my eyes fixed on the trees in front of me while the real threat closed in from the rear. I hunkered down behind a massive, fallen Douglas fir, pressing my face into the wet bark and trying to regulate my breathing so it wouldn't betray my position. The footsteps stopped just on the other side of the log, so close that I could hear the wet fabric of a rain jacket rubbing together as the person turned their head. I could hear them breathing, a heavy, labored sound that suggested they were frustrated, or perhaps excited by the hunt. Then, my phone vibrated in my hand, a silent notification that made my heart nearly stop, and I looked down to see a local Bluetooth pairing request from a device named The Architect. They were trying to connect to my phone, perhaps to play the recording directly into my own hand, or to track my location with even more precision. The audacity of the move gave me a sudden, sharp burst of clarity, and I realized that if they were using a Bluetooth interface, they had to be within 30 feet of me. I didn't wait for them to find me. I reached into my bag and pulled out a small, handheld bear spray canister, checking the safety in the dark by touch alone. I waited for the footsteps to start again, and as soon as I heard the crunch of boots on the other side of the log, I stood up and lunged over the top, spraying a massive orange cloud of stinging capsaicin into the space where the figure was standing. A scream erupted from the darkness, not a recorded voice, but a raw, human howl of agony as the chemicals hit their eyes and lungs. I didn't stay to see their face or to see if they were alone. I turned and ran with a desperation I had never known, ignoring the branches that whipped across my face and the rocks that threatened to break my ankles. I ran for what felt like hours, guided only by the distant, flickering light of a radio tower on a far-off ridge, my lungs burning with the cold mountain air. I didn't stop until I reached the gravel access road that led back to the ranger station, my body shaking with the onset of shock and exhaustion. When I finally reached the safety of the station and told the authorities what had happened, they went back to the site the next morning and found nothing but a series of high-powered, weatherproof speakers hidden in the trees and an empty tripod. There was no sign of the architect, and no record of anyone else being in that part of the park. But they did find one thing that still haunts my dreams every time I close my eyes. Taped to the back of one of the speakers was a printed transcript of every conversation I had had with myself over the last 3 days of my hike, transcribed with perfect accuracy. They hadn't just been recording the voices of strangers to lure me in. They had been recording me, listening to my thoughts and my fears while they waited for the perfect moment to play them back to me. I don't go into the deep woods anymore, because now I know that sometimes when you hear your own name being called from the trees, it isn't the wind, and it isn't your imagination. It's someone who has been listening to you for a very, very long time. I was staring at a human fingernail embedded in the bark of a pine tree when I realized that the trail markers I had been following for the last 5 miles were not put there by the Forest Service. My heart did a slow, sickening roll in my chest as I looked back down at my paper map, then up at the bright neon orange ribbon tied to a branch just a few feet away. According to my compass and the physical geography of the ridge, I should have been standing on the jagged peak of Mount Verity, looking down at the valley below. Instead, I was standing in a sunless, bowl-shaped depression where the trees grew so thick they seemed to be leaning inward, and the only sound was the frantic, wet thumping of my own pulse in my ears. I reached out to touch the orange ribbon, and my blood ran cold when I felt how fresh the plastic was, as if it had been tied there only minutes before I arrived. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Someone had purposefully redirected the main trail, systematically moving the official markers to lead hikers away from the safety of the ridge and down into this natural trap. I turned around to retrace my steps, but as I scanned the woods behind me, I saw that the orange ribbons were gone. In their place were small, subtle piles of gray stones that blended perfectly with the shadows, marking a path that I hadn't even noticed I was taking. I felt a sudden, sharp prickle of eyes on the back of my neck, the unmistakable sensation of being watched by someone who was hiding just beyond the limit of my vision. I whispered a quiet prayer and gripped the straps of my pack until my knuckles turned white, realizing that I was no longer a hiker, but a guest in a space designed for my disappearance. I began to move not toward the trail, but toward the steepest part of the slope, figuring that if I could just get to high ground, I could regain my bearings and find the real path. The air was getting colder as the sun dipped behind the western peaks, casting the forest into a hazy, purple gloom that made every twisted root look like a reaching hand. I hadn't gone more than 100 yards when I heard it. A low, rhythmic scraping sound, like metal being dragged over stone, echoing from the very direction I was heading. I froze, pressing my back against a massive cedar tree, my breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps that I tried desperately to silence. Who would be hauling heavy equipment this far into the backcountry, and why were they moving in perfect synchronization with my own attempts to escape? The scraping stopped, followed by the sound of a man whistling a cheerful, upbeat tune that felt jarringly out of place in such a desolate environment. It was a melody I recognized from an old radio commercial, and hearing it out here, miles from civilization, made my skin crawl with a sense of profound wrongness. I peeked around the edge of the cedar and saw a flicker of light through the trees. A small, handheld lantern bobbing up and down as someone walked leisurely along the very ridge I needed to reach. I watched, paralyzed, as the figure stopped and turned toward my hiding spot. The light of their lantern. I didn't wait for them to speak or move. I turned and ran in the opposite direction, sliding down a loose embankment of shale and dirt as the whistling suddenly turned into a harsh, commanding shout. "You're going the wrong way, friend. The view is much better up here if you just wait a minute." The voice was calm, almost bored, which made it 10 times more terrifying than a scream would have been. I crashed through a thicket of thorns that shredded my sleeves and bit into my forearms, but I didn't feel the pain, fueled only by the raw, animal instinct to put distance between myself and the man with the binoculars. I could hear him behind me now, his boots heavy and confident on the ground, moving with the ease of someone who had walked these woods every day of his life. As the last of the light vanished, I found myself standing at the edge of a narrow, lightless ravine, the sound of a rushing creek far below offering a slim hope of an exit route. I knew that the man would expect me to stay on the flat ground where he could easily track me, so I took a deep breath and began to scramble down the side of the ravine, using the darkness as my only cover. My fingers searched for handholds in the damp earth, and several times I felt the ground give way beneath me, sending me sliding toward what felt like an endless drop. I reached the bottom and plunged into the freezing water of the creek, the cold shocking my system and forcing the air from my lungs in a silent gasp. I waded through the water, keeping my head low and using the high walls of the ravine to hide my silhouette against the starlight. Above me, on the rim of the canyon, I saw the beam of a high-powered flashlight sweeping back and forth, cutting through the trees like a searchlight. I stayed perfectly still, submerged up to my waist in the icy current, watching as the light lingered on the spot where I had entered the ravine. I heard the whistling start again, but this time it was slower, more methodical, as if he were savoring the hunt now that he knew I was cornered. He knew there were only 2 ways out of this canyon, and he was likely heading for the bridge a mile downstream to cut me off before I could reach the road. I realized then that I couldn't outrun him on the established paths, so I did the only thing I could think of to break his cycle of logic. I pulled a small emergency fire starter from my pocket and a handful of dry moss I had tucked away earlier, and I set a tiny, controlled blaze inside a hollow log near the water's edge. As the smoke began to rise, I stripped off my bright red outer jacket and draped it over a branch near the fire, making it look like I had stopped to warm up and dry off. Then I climbed back up the steep wall of the ravine, not toward the exit, but back toward the area I had just fled from, banking on the idea that he would be so focused on the fire that he wouldn't look behind him. It worked. I watched from a high rocky ledge as the flashlight beam raced toward the small fire, the man's silhouette finally becoming visible as he stepped into the light of the flames. He was holding a heavy, rusted crowbar, and his face was twisted into a mask of pure, focused aggression. When he realized the jacket was empty and the fire was a decoy, he let out a roar of frustration that echoed through the valley. But by then, I was already a quarter-mile away, moving silently through the shadows of the high ridge. I found the real trail markers, the faded, official white blazes of the Forest Service, and I ran until my legs turned to jelly and my lungs felt like they were filled with broken glass. I didn't stop until I saw the headlights of a passing car on the Forest Service road, and even then, I stayed in the trees for a long time, watching to make sure the man wasn't waiting in the ditch. When I finally made it back to my own car and locked the doors, I sat in the silence for a long time, the heater blasting as I tried to stop my hands from shaking. I looked at the map one last time and realized that the false summit wasn't just a geographical error. It was a hunting ground, and I was the only one who had managed to walk out of it that season. I never went back to those woods, and even now, whenever I hear someone whistling a familiar tune in a quiet place, I find myself looking for the nearest exit.